Hello, everyone, and welcome to today's webinar. My name's Kieran, and I'm an impact lawyer from Mishcon de Reya. So this session today has two halves. The first half is, which I'm going to kick off with, is the legal aspects of starting an impact company and scaling an impact company. And I'll hand over to my co-presenter Jem to cover social investments. While I get the slides loaded up, Jem, do you want to quickly introduce yourself?
Sure, yeah. Hello, everyone. My name's Jem. I'm the founder of Daring Capital. We provide early stage investment finance into purpose-driven ventures. I'll cover that a little bit more later in my session, and looking forward to delivering it for you all.
Brilliant. Thanks, Jem. Before I kick off, Jem, can you see my first slide?
Yes, I can.
Yeah, brilliant. Great. So I guess firstly, thanks to everyone for joining today's session early on a Monday morning. If you're like me, you've had a few coffees already and hopefully you're ready to go and learn a bit more about legal models and also raising social investment. In terms of timing, we have about an hour and 15 minutes to play with. I'll spend around 30 minutes covering the legal aspects. Jem will spend 30 minutes covering social investment. And then we have around 15 minutes at the end for questions. Talking of questions, please submit these using the Q&A button, and we'll try our best to answer these at the end. After the session, you'll receive an email with a recording, as well as the slides and other helpful resources to read in your own time. And if you can notice on Zoom, there's a function to look at resources, and that's got our contact details as well as some other resources, but maybe you look at those once we've done the session. Okay, so I'm now going to briefly introduce myself, which I'll keep short and sweet. So I'm a lawyer that specializes in providing corporate, commercial, and governance advice to our impact clients. In no particular order, we advise innovative charities, universities, tech transfer offices, non-profits, philanthropists, social venture spin-out companies, and other founder-led companies that are intentionally set up to have a positive social and or environmental impact. I also have the pleasure of hosting our Positive Disruptors podcast, where I interview impact founders, funders, and enablers. We've released 4 episodes of Positive Disruptors, which can be found on all major podcast platforms. We've also got 2 more episodes lined up, so watch this space. Okay, it's probably enough for me, so I'll now move on to our objectives for the first part of today's session. Okay, so the first half of today's session is designed to provide you with an understanding of 3 topics. Firstly, the avenues to impact for companies. Next, we'll cover legal structures and starting a company. And I'll bring the first half to a close by covering legal models for impact companies. The content is geared towards founders and operators of startup and scale-up impact companies, but I hope that you'll all take something away from today's session. So we're going to kick off the session by covering avenues to impact. Without wanting to play up to the lawyer stereotype, we're kicking off part 1 with a definition of impact. This is provided by the Impact Frontiers, which is formerly called the Impact Management Project, which brought together stakeholders to reach a consensus on the definition of impact. I'll have a quick swig of water and give you all a moment to quickly read through this definition. So, this definition says that impact is a change in an outcome caused by an organization. An impact can be positive or negative, intended or unintended. An outcome is the level of well-being experienced by a group of people or the condition of the natural environment as a result of an event or action. So on screen, we've highlighted a few key points to pin down and discuss now. The first one is outcome. So impact is about the outcomes on people or the planet. For example, gender equality or halting biodiversity loss. Founders and operators can only be confident that impact is occurring when they can demonstrate that impact is being generated for the specific outcome they are focusing on. This is different to an output, which are tangible or direct results of a process, task, or activity. Outputs can be directly measured and often include deliverables such as products or services. For example, the number of people downloading an app. But going back to outcomes, there are numerous frameworks which can be used to help with pinning down an outcome of a venture. The most well-known impact frameworks are the UN Sustainable Development Goals, which is also called the SDGs. We've also got Better Society Capital's Outcomes Matrix, and also the Global Impact Investing Network's IRIS Plus framework. Most default to using the UN SDGs, but this comes with a bit of a health warning. Firstly, it's a policy framework rather than a tool designed for impact ventures, and it's also got some glaring gaps. For example, there's no outcomes focused on the LGBTQ plus community. But going back to the screen with our other highlighted words, we've got positive and negative. So whilst impact-minded founders hope to create a positive impact and often do, it's possible to create negative impacts both intentionally and unintentionally. For example, a venture could have a drone technology, which could be used to monitor a dwindling orangutan population in Indonesia, but it could also be used in warfare. So founders and operators have to be mindful of the actions of their company and actively seek to reduce negative impacts whilst also increasing positive impact. This is particularly important in a venture context where there's a lot of uncertainty about business models, at least in the early stages of the company. Okay, so we've provided a definition of impact. Now we're going to go on to how ventures can create impact. So from our perspective, there are broadly three ways that ventures can create positive impact. So to start with outsourcing. So a company can donate a percentage of profits to charity or undertake CSR activities, but this doesn't necessarily mean that its business model is to deliver positive social or environmental outcomes. By way of an example, if a venture has collected goods or money for a food bank, it may be reducing hunger. We wouldn't say that that is a direct outcome of the venture. The charity running the food bank is looking to deliver that outcome, and the venture is supporting the charity to do that. So your venture could do this, but you may feel that it's better to reinvest your profits so the venture itself can directly have a positive impact rather than outsourcing it. Next one is operations. So ventures may and should have a diverse board and purchase renewable energy, but gender equality and clean energy is not a direct outcome of the venture. It is operating the business in an impactful way, which is commonly referred to as ESG principles and practices. So it's worth considering how you operate from day one. It can be time consuming to retrofit a later stage business and how it operates. And more generally, I'd probably argue that operating in an impactful way should be the bare minimum for every business in 2024 and beyond. But if you're an early stage founder, you don't have to compare yourself to a later stage company, which probably has a head of ESG or a responsible business team whose sole focus is how the business can operate in an impactful way. It's about being proportionate to your company at the stage of its life cycle. The third way that ventures create impact is through products and services. So these type of companies are going that one step further and having direct impact through the outputs of their business. For example, an edtech company could provide inclusive and equitable education for its products. For these ventures, impact is not a nice to have, it's an intentional part of the business model where profit is in lockstep with impact. In terms of an overall message for this slide, I think it can be quite overwhelming for a founder to feel like they need to single-handedly move the dial on all the challenges we face as a society and as a planet. So consider focusing on perhaps one outcome where your impact is created through your products, your company's products and services. In terms of operational impact, I suggest focusing on what is proportionate to where your venture is in its life cycle. So for example, take diversity, equity and inclusion. If your company's pre-seed or seed, you could have a diverse team which aren't made up of people within your media network. If your company's further along in its life cycle, you could have a DE&I policy or even undertake a DE&I audit. If you'd like to read more about ESG in a startup context, Balderson Capital has a really helpful guide. In terms of outsourcing, as I was previously a charity trustee and currently advise charities, I'd never say don't donate to charity, but you might think that your venture could have more impact by building and scaling your company with outsourcing being something to focus on once your company's more established, or perhaps something for you to focus on in your own time with your own money. Okay, so now we've covered part one. We're now going to move on to part two, which is about legal structures and starting a company. So when you kind of get to this stage of your life cycle, you probably pin down the outcome of your venture, and now you want to think about the right legal structure that enables you to deliver that venture. So this part of the session, we're going to talk about various legal structures available and understand how the founder and any external investors will fit into the company's governance structure. So in theory, there are a bunch of different legal structures you could look at, such as a limited liability partnership and also community benefit societies. These are options to explore, but I'd say that probably 99.9% of impact companies are incorporated as a private limited company. There are 5 primary reasons for this, which we're going to cover now, starting at the top with simplicity. So private limited companies are relatively simple and cheap to set up. After paying a £50 fee to Companies House, you can incorporate what I'd call a normal private limited company in a matter of days, if not hours. You could instruct a lawyer to help with this, but in reality, it's fairly simple to do, and you probably can do so yourself using the step-by-step guidance. The second factor is that private limited companies are a well-known legal structure, which often helps when entering into contracts with third parties, including those overseas. The third factor is that these companies have what we call separate legal personality. So the company is a separate legal person in the eyes of the law, which can own land, enter into contracts, sue, and be sued. This helps protect the founder, who then doesn't have to do all these things in their own name. The next factor is limited liability, which means that a company is essentially responsible for its own debts and other liabilities, not the founders that sit behind it. And the final reason is flexibility. Each company is governed by a constitution, which can, to a significant extent, be tailored to the particular needs of the venture, its founders, and also the stakeholders. The constitution can be evolved as the venture grows and receive funding. A private limited company also allows a separation of ownership and management, which is helpful if you want to bring in additional expertise and funding. I'm going to explore that a bit more in a second. But for all those reasons, we're going to presume that your venture will be a private limited company. So the next decision which needs to be taken before you can set up is whether your company will be limited by guarantee or limited by shares. So broadly speaking, there are 3 key things that guides the decision on this. The first one is profits. So with a few exceptions, companies limited by shares are most commonly used where the owners want to extract profits, whilst companies limited by guarantee are mostly non-profit and non-distribution companies. This means that all the company's profits are reinvested in the business and contribute to furthering its purposes, rather than paid out to the company's owners by way of a dividend or other distribution. This doesn't mean that a non-profit company limited by guarantee is prevented from generating profit. The difference is what the management of the company does with that profit. Companies limited by shares can also be set up as non-distribution and non-profit companies. Its articles just need to be updated to include the relevant provisions. So the second factor is stakeholders. So this is kind of linked to the first factor on profits. Investors would generally not invest in a company limited by guarantee, as it's less common to extract profits from it compared to a company limited by shares. By contrast, some grant funders will be more comfortable with giving grant funding to a company limited by guarantee, precisely because it's harder to extract profits from it, for the personal gain of people involved and other private individuals. Aside from investors, also worth considering other stakeholders such as employees and any kind of partners of your venture. It's worth thinking about what they would prefer to work with. So, for example, charities, for no real legal reason, but often they find it easier to work with companies limited by guarantee. But on the flip side, some employees may have the expectations to receive a cut of the company through shares at some point in the future. So these kind of things need to come into the consideration. The third key factor is control. So in a company limited by guarantee, control is generally split equally between the founders. For example, 1/3, 1/3, 1/3. We've got 3 owners. Whereas in a company limited by shares, you have more flexibility. For example, the founders could own 75% or 3/4, with the other 25%, 1/4, owned by one or more external investors. Deciding which type of limited company is a key decision, as once a company is established as a company limited by shares, you can't convert it to a company limited by guarantee or vice versa. It is possible to transfer the assets, but this will involve some process and legal documents. Whilst I wouldn't necessarily suggest this and doing this on day one, you could consider setting up 2 legal entities, one as a limited by shares company and one as a limited by guarantee. This may enable you to receive grant funding into the CLG and investment into the CLS. Whilst this is possible, you need to carefully consider the relationship between the two entities, document this in arm's length transaction documents, and also check this doesn't breach any terms of a grant funding agreement or any other key contract. If you'd like to explore this in a bit more detail, welcome to get in touch with me and we can chat through offline. So, whichever model you end up going for, your company will have owners and managers. So the owners of the company limited by guarantee are called members, and the owners of the company limited by shares are called shareholders. In both types of limited company, the managers are called directors. So let's start with the owners. So the owners are the persons who ultimately control the company and who have the ultimate backstop powers in the company's constitution, which are primarily its articles of association. So, for example, the owners have the power to change the company's constitution and to decide whether to wind up the company. In terms of managers, in contrast, these are individuals who have day-to-day control of the company, and they are bound by certain legal duties under company law, which regulates how they can behave. For example, they have to avoid putting themselves in a position where they might have a conflict of interest. Company law also imposes certain responsibilities on directors. For example, the responsibility to file accounting and company information with Companies House. In terms of the numbers, all companies must have at least one owner and one director, but they can be the same person. In terms of the numbers of directors, there's no hard and fast rule about this, but it's a good starting point could be 3, but you might eventually look to have 5, but I wouldn't suggest it's feasible to have anything more than 12. In terms of another tip, it's worth having odd numbers to prevent deadlock. Okay, looking at this from a founder perspective, as a founder, you'll likely want to be the owner and the director of the company. So you have day-to-day control, as well as the power to ensure that the company closely follows your vision and keeps you involved. If you receive investment, the investor will also be an owner and may expect to appoint an investor director who will sit on the boards and also have day-to-day control. So a moment ago, we talked about the distinction between shareholders and directors. And here's a simple illustration of governance structure. And for the purpose of this, we're using shareholders rather than members just for the investment context. Essentially, power is delegated down and accountability flows up. Certain decisions need to be taken at a shareholder level and some need to be taken at a director level. So if you're both, it's important to be crystal clear which metaphorical hat you're wearing and record this decision in writing, ideally in formal board minutes. It's also possible to include other layers in a governance structure, for example, having subcommittees and staff. But for the purposes of this session, we look to keep it simple with a simple governance structure. So now we're going to cover the role of the founder in the governance structure. As the founder want overall control, as well as day-to-day control, the founder is likely to be a shareholder and a director. In terms of their contributions, the founder will typically provide the company with money, expertise, and probably the most valuable thing in the whole world, time. In exchange, the founder should benefit financially as a director through a salary and as a shareholder through dividends and possibly an exit. But if you're all early stage founders, you know that may be something a bit further in the future than you maybe hope. Impact founders also have the, non-tangible benefit and perhaps fuzzy benefit of making a positive impact, which is, the reason why you're all in this space as well. Whilst you don't necessarily have to, some ventures look for external investment in order to help accelerate the impact of a company. The investors can provide the company with cash, insights, and networks in exchange for sharing the company's distributable profits and rights in accordance with the company's governing document, which might include appointing an investor director on the board. So we talked about legal structures, and in particular, the most popular legal structure, which is a private limited company. But if you want your venture to make a positive impact, you're likely to want to go that one step further by using an impact model which embeds impact within your company's DNA. We call these types of companies impact ventures or social ventures. There are 3 relatively well-known impact models and one model we've created to provide impact-driven founders with a relatively simple model that enables a startup or existing business to embed impact in its company's constitution. The 3 well-known models are community interest company, social enterprise, and B Corp. And the model we created is called Embed. So in this part 3, we summarize each model, plot them on the scale, and outline the key questions that may help you with pinning down the right model for your company. So let's start with the first model, which is community interest company, which is often abbreviated to KIC because it's quite a long word. So KICs are businesses that operate with a social purpose, where profits are largely reinvested back in the business with limited distribution to outside investors. It's a relatively new form of company that legally safeguards the social mission, but still allows directors to be paid. It's an increasingly popular model with approximately 700 KICs registered in July 2024 alone. In terms of key features, firstly, we have the community interest test, which differentiates KICs from other for-profit legal structures and must be passed in order to achieve and to maintain KIC status. It would be for the KIC to determine the community it intends to benefit, but the KIC regulator must be satisfied that a reasonable person might consider that the activities of the KIC will be carried on for the benefit of the community. A company won't pass this test if it carries on political activities or if the activities only benefit members of a particular body. Next, we have the asset lock, which is designed to ensure that the company retains and uses their assets to further the community benefit purposes. This legal requirement is a fundamental feature of KICs and typically provides reassurance to funders who take comfort that their funding will be dedicated permanently to the community benefit purposes. And this is particularly important for grant funders. KICs are subject to what we call light touch regulation by the KIC regulator, and this external accountability can provide legitimacy and comfort to stakeholders such as grant funders. The KIC regulator has statutory powers, including the ability to change the company's directors and also wind up the company. As with all the models covered in this session, in terms of tax, KICs aren't charities and therefore are in the same position as any other type of limited company, which, depending on your view about tax, might not be a bad thing. In terms of other benefits and limitations, the legal requirements to reinvest at least 65% of distributable profits may make it more difficult to obtain external investment. But compared to other types of impact models we're covering today, KICs may be more likely to obtain charitable or other grant funding. There isn't, particularly speaking, a legal reason for this, but it's more about the approach of grant funders. So the next model is social enterprise, and you've probably come across this term, but it's not a legally defined term. So some companies may call themselves social enterprises without strictly speaking being one. To be a certified social enterprise by Social Enterprise UK, a business has to be established for a social or environmental purpose and must reinvest at least 50% of its profits. This can be quite restrictive to training investments, but social enterprises are a relatively well-known way of doing business, and they often closely align to the charity sector. The third model is B Corp. So this is a worldwide movement that certifies businesses which meet high standards of verified social and environmental performance, public transparency, and legal accountability to balance profit and purpose. B Corps have a purpose that includes profit, but also social and environmental factors. This model is increasingly popular in consumer-facing businesses, so you may see B Corps in the supermarket aisles or when you're purchasing goods online. And some really well-known examples are Patagonia, Innocent Drinks, and Tony's Chocolonely. Okay, so we've now covered the three models of the most well-known impact models, but now we're going to cover ours, which is called Embed. So this is a bespoke impact model, which we created based on our experience of working with impact companies who often have to grapple with some of the limitations of the other impact models. We call it Embed as it enables founders to embed impact in their startup or established business. With the Embed model, the company has a bespoke constitution, which contains impact-aligned provisions, but also flexibility, which is often helpful for early-stage founders. The key provision is a purpose clause, which specifies the outcome that the venture is seeking to achieve, as well as an indication of how the company will achieve that outcome. A founder can pick and choose other impact-aligned provisions as well. For example, the legal requirement to produce an annual impact report, provisions regarding impactful operations, and also a clause which entrenches the purpose in such a way that it can only be removed or amended by unanimous decision of all shareholders. Through Embed, the founders can demonstrate how their venture is intentionally impactful, whilst providing the platform for the company to receive investment to help with funding the impact of the venture. So we like to illustrate the four main impact models using this scale. On the left-hand side of the scale, we've got charities, which are driven purely by social impact. And on the right-hand side of the scale, we have purely profit-generating businesses, which are driven largely by financial returns for shareholders. The models I've just mentioned sit somewhere in between. We plot KICs on the left-hand side of the scale because this model is subject to light touch regulation and has restrictions on distribution of profits. This is also why certified social enterprises are near the left-hand side of the scale. Embed can move up or down depending on the founder's vision for the company, but mostly we mostly see embed companies around here because they've got a bespoke purpose. They haven't restricted the distribution of profits, in turn providing opportunities to seek investment. B Corps are nearer the right-hand side of the scale because they have a pro forma purpose, which isn't focused on a specific outcome, with no restrictions on the distribution of profits. I think the key thing to mention on this slide here is that if you set up a KIC, if you want to change the model, the only option you have is going further to the left, which is converting to a charity or winding up. This may be fine for your venture, but some founders prefer a model like Embed, which provides a bit more flexibility in the early stages. I'm conscious of time, so I'm now going to move on to the next slide, which is based around the kind of key questions we run through with founders when we're helping them to pick the right impact model. In terms of these questions, we kind of grouped them into 5 key categories, which we're going to run through now, starting with regulation. So a key question is, how regulated do you want your venture to be? Do you want an external regulator like a KIC regulator? Because that maybe provides credibility in the eyes of stakeholders. The next factor is people. So do you want the ability to pay profits to yourselves as the founder and to any other investors? Do you also need to incentivize your executive staff or the wider pool of employees? And once you're set up, how involved will you be in the company? Next one is IP. So is there valuable intellectual property to commercialize? Who owns it and how will it be exploited? If IP is owned by KIC, it must only be used in accordance with the asset lock, which does provide some limitations. In terms of purpose, are you clear on the impactful outcome of your venture and how your venture will create that impact? Do you want a bespoke purpose, or are you happy with a pro forma purpose, such as the B Corp purpose, which is generic and broadly needs to be adopted as written? Similarly, are you comfortable with measuring or reporting your impact and providing this information to stakeholders? And the final one is a big one, funding. And ultimately, there could be a separate section on its own. I know Gem's going to talk a bit more about investment now, but in addition to revenue, what are the main sources of external funding for your venture? Are you focusing on investment or are you focusing on securing grant funding? And this can influence where you sit on the scale. And obviously, you're welcome to get in touch with me if you'd like to discuss in a bit more detail. But I'm going to bring this first part of the session to a close. We're talking about other legal things to think about. The first one on the left-hand side is transaction documents. So this really depends on the transaction, but if you're receiving equity investment, this would be documents like a term sheet, shareholders agreement, and other founder services agreements. The next legal thing to think about is data protection. So you need to consider how you'll inform your customers about how you'll process their personal data. And this is usually done by a privacy policy displayed on your website. You'll need to register with the ICO if you want to do anything more complex with that data. Next one is IP. So you need to check that the company owns the IP to exploit it. And this may necessitate founders, consultants, and volunteers assigning IP to the company. Next one is trademarks. So it's advisable to run a trademark search to check if your company name is identical or similar to another business name or brand in the UK. If it is, you may need to rebrand or pay a fee. If it's not, you could obtain formal protection by submitting a trademark application. Next one is employees. How are you going to engage members of the team? Are they going to be employees in law or are they going to be consultants which provide more flexibility? It's important to speak to an employment lawyer about this because there are certain restrictions you have to comply with if people are employees, and it doesn't really matter what you call the document. It's kind of the reality of the relationship. And next and final thing to mention is commercial agreements. So this is formalized agreements with other legal entities and individuals are designed to limit your risk and set out what's expected of the parties. And this really depends on what you're doing, but typical agreements are like NDAs, non-disclosure agreements, IP licenses or assignments, and also terms and conditions when you sell goods or services to customers. So I appreciate there's a lot of legal things to think about, But our general approach is to not over-lawyer and focus on the key aspects for your business, which could be securing funding and mitigating key risks through a contract. Before I hand over to Jem, I want to quickly recap what we covered in this first half. So part one, we provided a definition of impact and the avenues to impact for companies. In part two, we explored legal structures and starting a company. And we brought the session to a close by covering the most well-known legal models for impact companies. We've got the KICS, social enterprises, B Corp, and Embed. I'll be around at the end for questions, but now I'll hand over to Jem to cover social investment. So over to you, Jem.
Great. Thanks so
Nice.
much, Kieran. That was
Pleasure.
incredibly helpful. Hello, everyone. Lovely to meet you all. My name's Jem. I'm the founder of Daring Capital. I'm just going to share my slides. Can you all see that? Can you see that, Kieran?
Yes, can see that. Go ahead.
Great. So what we will cover today, we'll cover a few things. So just to be really clear, this is a beginner's guide to social investment. We're not trying to overcomplicate this. We're not going to go into anything too complicated, hopefully, although if there's any questions, happy to deal with more detail. This is going to be an overview of the different options for social investment. So we'll cover a definition of social investment, what social investment is not. So we're just going to do a little bit of myth busting there. And we'll cover.
Sorry, Jem. I think the cut slides, people can't see the slides yet. So
Sorry.
sorry to interrupt you there. I think we've got a few questions, messages saying people can't see the slides yet, but
Can you see them, Kieran? Sorry.
I can, yeah. Maybe Lucky in the background can work his magic, maybe.
Oh, now are they up there now?
Yeah, I can still see. I'm seeing looking in the Q&A section to see if anyone else can see them as well. Yes, I think they're showing now. Great.
Great. All right.
Go ahead.
Awesome. Thank you. Good to know that people are watching, paying attention. That was a little test. Cool. Yeah. So a bit of myth busting. We'll cover the three main types of social investment. So debt, RPA, which stands for revenue participation agreements. We'll define what that is, don't worry. And equity investment. And I'll have a slide on further resources. So without further ado, a little bit about me. So I'm the founder of something called Daring Capital. We're an investment syndicate. So that means we're a group of investors that find extraordinary social entrepreneurs starting purpose-driven businesses. We invest in them and we support them to grow. I'm a poacher turned gamekeeper, if you like. So prior to that, I ran a social enterprise called the Bike Project. We provide bikes to refugees in the asylum seekers across the UK. So I ran that for about 12 years. We grew to about 9 cities in the UK. Had a couple of million turnover. So yeah, had some ups and downs with that over the years, which I'll talk about maybe in another webinar. So what is social investment? So this is from Good Finance, which is a great resource for all things social investment. So social investment is the use of repayable finance to help an organization achieve a social purpose. So the key bits are there has to be a social purpose there, hence the social, and there is some kind of repayment involved through whatever it might be, but the investor gets their money back in some way. So those are the two key elements of the definition. What social investment is not. So this is really important because there's lots of things that are bandied around about social investment. So it's not philanthropy. So in the US in particular, the word invest is used quite loosely to also include philanthropy. We're not talking about philanthropy here today. We're talking about, not talking about venture philanthropy or anything like that. Really talking about where, as I said in the previous definition, there is some kind of repayment of the capital through whatever means that might be. But yeah, there is some kind of repayment. It is not philanthropy. And crucially, social investment is most often not cheap. So there is a perception that social investment is actually more affordable than mainstream finance, or that it is in some way like concessionary. In most cases, it's not actually, and in a lot of cases, it's more expensive than mainstream finance. Why is that? That's because, well, you can argue whether this is right or wrong, but that's because in social investors' minds, they're taking more risks. They're taking bets on social enterprises or businesses that are, for whatever reason, more early stage, a bit riskier, have a lower rate of return, and therefore they need to charge a bit more to compensate for that. That's the logic there. But it's really important to note that most social investment isn't particularly cheap or isn't really what they call concessionary. It's also not easily accessible. Social investment processes tend to be pretty long. If you're applying, it's different if you're dealing with angels, obviously, but if you're, applying to a mainstream social investor, it can be a pretty big process, involving a lot of work, a lot of documents submitted, as most people that have been through it will tell you. So I think it's just important to note those three things at the start, to get rid of a few myths, and that'll all become obvious as we go through each one. It's not philanthropy, it's not cheap, and it's not easily accessible for the most part. Cool. Okay, so three types of social investment we'll cover. Debt, so interest-bearing loans to. So I'm going to use the word social enterprise here to cover. Obviously, you've all listened to Kieran's talk, and he's covered all the different types. For just as a shorthand, I'm going to use the word social enterprise to cover all forms of businesses that we're looking at. There is debate about what that means, but I'm just using that word to cover everything. So interest-bearing loans, social enterprises. RPA is where the interest is dependent on the financial performance of social enterprise. I'll break that down a bit more in a minute. And equity is buying shares in businesses. So we'll go through each one. So to start with, debt. So there is unsecured and there is secured debt. Unsecured, so means that there is no, the best analogy is probably a house, right? If you get a mortgage, your debt is secured against the house. That means something goes wrong, you can't pay it back, they will take the house. So that basically has the guarantee and sell the house and use that to repay the debt. That means that the investor has a guarantee, some kind of guarantee that they are getting repaid because it is what is known as secured. Unsecured is where there is no specific thing, no specific asset that the loan is secured against, which means that if it goes wrong, they don't have like an asset that they can sell to repay it. So that it's a really important distinction when you're looking at these models. So social investment intermediaries do provide repayable loans for usually for specific projects, not just general growth, to social enterprises. Loan terms, so I say loans are 20k to 1 million. So CAF technically do from 20k. I'd say most loans are 100k plus. It's harder. There may be some a bit smaller, but certainly 50k plus. Pretty rare to find the option of getting a 20k loan in my experience anyway. Technically CAF say they provide it, but it's not that common. Generally it's 6 to 12 months capital repayment holiday. So you've got 6 to 12 months before you have to start repaying the capital. You're probably repaying the interest in that time. 6 to 10% interest rates. I'd say 6 is pretty low. I think mostly you're probably looking at least 8, but 6 is technically possible. Sometimes there's what's known as arrangement fee. That's just a setup fee of another 2 to 3% of the value. And there's often a floating charge. I'll put that in there to inform you. For the sake of time, I'm not going to go into what a floating charge is now. You can kind of Google it afterwards. And generally, it's available. These loans are usually available to businesses that are turning over at least 100k. Rare to find loans, certainly of any size, that are available to early stage businesses. Why is that? That's because if you think about it, to actually make this kind of model work, you need quite a short turnaround time. You've got 12 months, with it immediately after you take that loan on day one, you're starting to pay interest. So there's a little bit of money there. But then within 6 to 12 months, you're starting to repay the capital. So you need to be, if you think about the business, you need to be, your business model needs to be generating revenue very, very quickly from that project, extra revenue, because it needs to be repaying not only its normal debts, but this extra debt very quickly. So that's it's a pretty quick turnaround, and so it's really only suitable for very specific use cases. So when we look at what are the pros and cons of this model, so I think the pros are for, as Kieran mentioned, some businesses have, if you're limited by shares, then great, you can access equity. Well, we can come on to equity in a minute, but if you're not limited by shares, you don't have share capital, you can't access equity. So debt or RPA, which we'll come on to, may actually be your only option. So it can be very useful for that. It also is, so that's useful if you're like a KIC or you're a company limited by guarantee or a charity. The cons of it are it's not cheap. It's impatient, as I mentioned before. It's pretty quick turnaround. It's not patient capital, and it's fairly inflexible. So let's say your project goes really well, you start repaying it, brilliant. If it goes badly, you're still on the hook for this money, right? It doesn't. The social investor is not in it with you. They heads. If it goes well, brilliant, they get the money back. If it goes badly, they still get the money back. You still have to repay them. So it is quite inflexible in that way. In practice, the most common use cases for this type of capital that I've seen, so by way of background, so I also sit on the social investment committees for two large foundations, so we see a lot of debt models. I'd say the biggest use case is public sector contracts, where you need some you're basically guaranteed the money, but you need the cash up front to pay your costs. It's basically a cash flow issue. So you know that the contract is coming in, you know that you'll get a guaranteed income source from it pretty quickly, but you need some cash up front to, do something with that higher staff, etc. It's a cash flow problem, short-term cash flow problem. Most common providers well, there's loads, but Social Investment Business is a big one. SIB, CAF Venturesome, Big Issue Invest have a number of funds that deliver this. Cool. Moving on to secured debt. Again, very similar to unsecured debt. So this is where typically you buy a building. I don't think I've ever seen an example of this where it's not of secured debt, where it's not a building, where it's a different type of asset. Building is a fairly standard thing. So again, terms are very similar, except the interest rate is lower, and that's because it's secured. So it's a much safer bet for a social investor, because they know if something goes wrong, that it's secured against an asset such as a building. This is the most common form of debt, more common than unsecured debt, because you buy, it's just very straightforward. You go for, let's say you're setting up a cafe, you need the money to buy the building, you buy the building, or you're setting up a children's home, that's very common too. You buy the building, you get the people in, you start generating the money, and it's secured against the home. It's a very straightforward model. So that's very common, very easy for social investors to understand and feel safe about. Pros and cons relatively similar before as well. So we've got a little example here, Campus Skate Parks, not-for-profit organization using skateboarding to engage with young people. They had one skate park up and running, so they could know the model, they knew the ins and outs of that model. They secured a loan of 80k from Big Issue Invest to cover the refurbishment costs of their second site. So, they had the model up and running, they knew how it worked, they knew that the cash would come in pretty quickly with the second model, and secured a loan to help them achieve that. Cool, RPA. So slightly complicated, can be slightly complicated, but essentially you pay a percent. The way it works, a bit like a loan, but instead of repaying a fixed interest rate, you pay a percentage of your sales over a fixed period of time. So basically, let's say you borrow 100 grand, you might say, okay, you get a year repayment holiday, and then you pay off, let's say, 5-10% of your sales over a 3 to 5 year period. And that means that the risk is its risk is shared a bit more between investor and the company. Why does that matter? Well, if it's a slightly riskier project, let's say you don't know how it's going to go, you then can say, well, we only repay a higher amount if it goes well. Usually you still have to repay the capital, rare that that's not the line. But it's a much lower interest rate a much lower repayment rate if it goes badly. Usually it's also capped. So let's say it goes absolutely wild. The investor doesn't get all of that money. It's capped over a period of time and capped at usually a multiple of the original value. So yeah, the advantage of this is it just, it's a bit less risky for the venture. The disadvantage I'd say is, well, a couple of disadvantages. I'd say it's gone out of fashion. I mean, it'd be interesting to hear what Kieran thinks he sees so much. It's gone out of fashion a bit amongst social investors purely because it's a bit complicated. If you're a really simple business with one income stream, one product, that's quite straightforward, but that's quite rare. What ends up often happening is you start saying, well, but this income stream wasn't related to that, and this was, and so the legal agreements, the administration of it can be quite complex, and for that reason, it's gone out of fashion a bit amongst social investors. The other disadvantage is there is, let's say things are going really well. Let's say Campus Gate Parks, they did it. They set up one, when it goes well, they raised a loan to do another one. They're then a little bit hampered because they can't reinvest the profits from the next. They're limited in how much the profit from the next one they can reinvest in setting up a third one, and that's because they're paying a huge amount out. So if it goes well, it's actually very expensive. You're paying a lot of money at a time where, well, it depends on your goals, but if you're ambitious, you want to grow more, you're very hampered because you've got this massive cost that you're paying out all the time. So that it's for specific things, it can be very helpful. It has its pros and cons. It's also not widely available anymore. Growth Impact Fund quite like this. It's it's partnership between Limited and Big Issue Invest. They quite like this model. So if you're eligible for them, that might be something for them to look at. CAF also technically offer it. I don't know how common in practice they actually offer it. Cool. And so I have an example here for you all. The Charity Technology Trust, I had to really dig deep to do a lot of research to find someone that had made this work. So providing pro bono digital software to the charity sector through its portal. They were already pretty well established, so generating 500k in revenue, including 80k from the portal. They secured 50k in RPA from CAF Venture them to grow their platform, and CAF were owed 2% of revenue over a 5-year period. That's pretty low, I'd say. 2%, that's a pretty concessionary amount, which it maybe is why it worked so well. But it worked really well for both parties and allowed them to grow their portal pretty quickly. Great. Moving on. Equity. Okay. I'm going to just equity, so basically that is the sale of shares. I'm not going to go into a lot of detail about what it is now. You can look up afterwards, but effectively it's a sale of shares. So let's say you initially own 100% of the company. By the end, so let's say you're selling part of the company at a certain price. So you sell the shares to generate and use the revenue to help you grow and develop the business. So to start with, you own 100%, but as you can see here, you sell a minority stake to investor who owns 20% afterwards. So the most common providers of equity finance are what are known angel investors, private investors, or venture capital funds, and we'll cover both now. So impact VC is this kind of term used for venture capital firms that have an impact focus. So they are in many ways, so they are basically a fund. So they have raised money from external investors, and they then manage a pool of money to invest in high growth, high return businesses with global returns and very large potential markets. What's really important to note here is impact VC is usually not concessionary. So it's usually, concessionary is the wrong word here, sorry. They usually no real compromise on returns. So they are looking for very similar levels of returns to a standard venture capital fund. That means they're looking for businesses that can grow really, really quickly and achieve a huge exit. So sell for huge amounts of money within 5 to 7 years. So amounts vary wildly. If you're early stage, maybe 200k to 5 million. 5 million is at a much, much later stage, really. Returns are generated through the sale of business, so you're not paying anything in the meantime. They're not interested in dividends. They're interested in the business being sold. So investors typically look for returns of 10x within 5 to 7 years. That means that you have to grow really, really fast, tens, hundreds of millions of turnover is something is your goal. Realistically, there are not that many use cases that fit that. Mostly technology, pretty much exclusively technology. B2B, so business to business, SaaS, so software is, business to business software essentially isn't very common. Most common area within the impact space is climate tech, for obvious reasons, can provide huge growth in a way that other impact business models may struggle with. There are a few common providers: Growth Impact Fund, Ascension, The Conduit, Green Angel Ventures, and Ada are loosely impact, I'd say. The pros of this, so pros of, there's pros of equity more generally. Your interests are aligned. So if they win, you win. If they lose, you lose. You can raise large amounts of capital potentially, and you don't need to pay it back until there is an exit. It's worth pointing out at the moment we're also going through a little bit of, well, I'll come on to the cons and click on that. So cons are, this only works for for-profit structures. You have to be, have shares. It only really works for high growth companies, very, very high growth companies. And there's also a loss of control there. So you have to exit. Realistically, you're very, very unlikely to be able to buy it back yourself. You're going to need to sell it either PO, private equity, maybe a competitor, and you're going to need to sell it within a time frame. They'll also come sit on your board. They'll have a lot of power over the business. They're very, very focused on growing to meet that exit. So the pros and cons to that. It's worth also noting that we're going through a little bit of a winter in terms of venture capital. It's a very tough market out there to raise venture capital in to high interest rates for a load of complicated reasons. So it's not a lot of venture capital money out there at the moment, particularly at early stage. The other thing to note, sorry, is that you have to be generating sort of six-figure revenue to make this work. Cool. Private investors. So this is the other type of equity investment. So individual investors, known as angels and family officers, which are sort of essentially incredibly wealthy people, employ people to manage their money. They deploy money into for-profit businesses. So there's a huge range of types of a huge range of interest within private investors. So the terms, the criteria will vary hugely, unlike VC, which is quite consistent in terms of how they approach these things. Returns will be generated through a sale of the business. In some instances, it could be through dividends. Angels tend to could invest at a very early stage. Family offices tend to invest a little bit more, but a little bit further down the line, probably not at a very early stage. So it's worth bearing that in mind. Not always easy to access. So if you've got good networks, then great. If not, syndicates, Daring Capital, Conduit or Green Angels are a good way of going for them. Association Charitable Foundations, can look that up, have open days where businesses can pitch to potential foundations that might invest. LinkedIn is a big one. Being active on LinkedIn, finding investors, DMing them is a great way to find potential angel investors. It's not easy to find them if you don't have those networks, but I'd say probably syndicates is probably your best bet. The pros, like with VC, your interests are aligned. If they win, you win. Lose, you lose. But the big advantage over VC is that it's much easier to find angels that are more aligned with what you want to do if you don't want to, grow incredibly fast and sell to private equity or something. You are more likely to find angels that will want you to grow, but maybe a bit more flexible on terms, maybe a little bit more interested in your impact. More likely to find angels that want to invest on the terms that you want to raise money at because they believe in what you're doing or whatever the reason might be. They're less involved in your business. I mean, it's not necessarily the case, but you can negotiate so they're less involved with your business. They're not so controlling over how you exit, how you manage it. there's also, well, like with all equity, there's no cap on how much you can raise, whereas with debt and RPA, there is a realistically there's you can't be what's called over leveraged. So you can't just raise millions and millions of debt because then you've got all this money to pay back, right? With equity, there's not really that cap. You can just keep, if you can raise it, you can keep raising money if you can find the investors. There's not like a kind of a limit on what you can raise. Um, I'd say the big con is for profit, only for for-profit businesses. Again, it has to be share capital. Um, they can be hard to find, and that can also, you generally need several. It's unlikely that one angel is going to come in by themselves. Means you have, lots of, you might have lots of different angels. You have to manage a group of angels, a group of investors. It's an investor group that you have to talk to rather than just like one or two. But maybe a bit more work and maybe competing demands there as well. So there aren't a ton of examples of successful exits in this space because it's quite new and exits can take exit by exit, I mean the shares are sold. But here's like probably one of the big ones. So Oomph is helping older people stay healthy by running specialist exercise classes in care homes. They secured 2.1 million over multiple rounds to scale their offering and provide it online. Investors were repaid, I think, after about 8 years through the sale of Oomph to a larger software company. So that's one of the big examples. Great, we're doing great time. So some further resources, I'd say if you're looking for further resources, you've got Good Finance. Lots of they're pretty introductory guides. I wouldn't say it's hugely comprehensive, but they do have guides. They're also launching a course with School for Social Entrepreneurs, which is just out actually about with an intro to social investment. They also have a database of social investors, which is free to access. All the guide, everything on here is free. Alternative Funding School, they have a mailing list that shares lists of new investors. We're signing up to that. They've just launched a paid database as well. And Daring Capital, we have a newsletter that we share lots of tips on fundraising. You can also look at our blog. So yeah, 10:57, doing great time. That is it for my presentation. We'll move on to some questions.
Brilliant. Thanks for that, Jem, and thanks everyone for posting some questions. I picked out, I think, about 5 questions in total, but first I'm going to share some of the helpful pointers that other people put in the Q&A chat. So Guilia, I think hopefully I pronounced your name correctly, if not apologies, mentioned there's Good Finance, got a list of investors providing social investment, and maybe Daring Capital might be in that list as well. Lauren from First Port in Scotland says that they offer RPAs through their capital fund. So if you're a venture based in Scotland, maybe go and check that out. And Kevin, shared some interesting insights that Tony Hawk was a friend of your brother's. So that's essentially one on the skate park example. But I guess in terms of the questions, I think most of them are directed at you, Jem. So I'm going to ask a few of them first. So we've got a question from Rick Mower, who's part of Raw, which is a fantastic social business in Oxford. So Rick asks you, Jem, will CAF, SIB, etc. offer unsecured debt finance to company them to buy shares with a social mission?
Will CAF
Yeah, will
offer?
CAF, social investment business, and other examples offer unsecured debt finance to company limited by shares that have a social mission?
So so it does vary a bit from investor to investor. I'd say most social investors that are providing debt finance will look at that, but they will want if you're not a KIC, you're a company limited by shares, they may want other types of restrictions like a profit lock or an asset lock or a mission lock. Lots of locks there to look at, which Kieran can probably explain what they are better than me. But they'll want some kind of other structure within your governance that either secures your social mission, make sure that that's really embedded in what you do, or that restricts the ability for you or maybe other investors to sell assets or to take too much profit out of the company. So it will vary, and it's worth contacting them. But usually it's doable if you're willing to put in place other bits of governance that will show that you're not going to take all the money out and that you're really dedicated to your mission.
Yeah, in terms of the asset lock from a legal perspective, basically, if your asset is valued, say, at £100, you can only distribute that outside of an asset locked organization if it's for full market value or to another asset locked body, which might be a community interest company or another company with that, or charity or another company with that purpose built in that's locked down, which basically means you can't distribute it for an undervalue. So a bit of that comes to getting the assets valued, but it takes us a bit on to Anushu's question. So you ask about, can IP be considered an asset if tying it to secure investment funding? So I guess probably maybe I could start quickly, Jim, and hand over to you. But I guess it's probably an accountant's probably best place to pin this down. But I think an IP is an intangible asset, sorry, on a balance sheet. But I don't know, Jem, is that anything you've come across in your world?
Yeah, so I'd say the point of an asset is that it's worth something. It's definitely worth something, and that you can easily, like a building, property is very well established with valuations and how much it's worth, and that it can easily be sold. I think you'd struggle to make that case. It's obviously a little bit case by case, but I think you'd struggle to make a proposal that IP, unless it's particularly valuable, could be used as a secure asset. Yeah, I think that would be a struggle, to be honest, without, I mean, obviously, yeah, without knowing more about your situation, but I could be wrong.
Brilliant. Thanks for that, Jem, and also thanks for the question as well. We've got Lee Willows from ESG Gaming, which is another great social impact organization. So Lee's got two questions, but perhaps due to time, we'll cover on one. So Lee asked a question related to campus parks, kind of asking why didn't they take on a grant from a lottery or a livery company to refurbish the park, and then there's no money to pay back. Um, any thoughts on that, Jem?
Yeah, so, well, I'll talk. So, as I mentioned at the beginning, I ran a social enterprise called the Bike Project. We are, I handed it over, still going. We were a registered charity. Um, we were very much eligible for grants. So why did we raise social finance? Two reasons. One, um, in our experience, it was hard to find grant. Three reasons, essentially. It's hard to find grants that want to do this, like want to work in this way. Most grants want you to achieve direct social outcomes, but like for us, we wanted money to set up a new shop, right? There were social outcomes eventually because we refurbished the bike, sold the bikes, used the money, but it's so many steps that was a harder sell. And the ones that were very, very competitive for social investors get this, and they also can provide the finance at scale. So, okay, 80K, maybe that's doable for grants, but what if you need 300K? That's really hard to raise at an early stage, that kind of money through grants. So it's a lot easier. It's a lot easier is maybe a bit strong, but there's a lot less competition for social finance. If you're eligible as a business, there's a lot more money out there that's looking for a home from social finance. They get something like a new skate park. That's an intuitive thing they get. You don't have to sell it to them. Lottery money is super competitive. And if you can access grants, you might just want to use it for other bits that won't be eligible for social investment, right? Like grants are so hard to get that, it's so competitive at the moment that, you just want to focus on the bits of the organization that really need it.
Brilliant. Thanks for Jem, and thanks for the question as well. We've got another question from Alexandra. So Alexandra asks, if you are an organization or company limited by guarantee, is there an investment opportunity in terms of angel or family office investing? So I guess, well, strictly speaking, angels and family offices can give you money, but I think you'd be quite hard pressed as a company limited by guarantee to find that kind of investment because of theoretically, as you mentioned, you essentially can't really invest in a company limited by guarantee. They may want to do it in kind of a venture philanthropy kind of mindset, maybe give you some money um, to help you get to the next level. But obviously, there's no way for them to kind of receive distributable profits back as a result of that funding. So you could ask them to give you that funding, but I think most likely in investment context is probably unrealistic. But Jem, have you got any other experience of that or any other thoughts to share?
Yeah, I'd say it's hard. I mean, you could, so you've got no shares, so they normally deal in shares. There's also, which we haven't gone into, huge tax benefits for private individuals called EIS and SEIS, which won't be available if you haven't got share capital. If you know them really well, you could ask them for a concessionary loan of some sort. Um, it's not typically what they do. Particularly family office might struggle with that. An angel maybe would think about that. There used to be a scheme called SITR, which we won't go into now, that did provide tax breaks for individuals providing social finance to eligible organizations, but that no longer exists. So yeah, I think theoretically possible, but pretty difficult to, it's a pretty difficult sell in practice. If you've got really good relationships with somebody and you've got a really good case, it is possible, but it's to go do it via debt or grants maybe, but it's not easy.
Yeah, agreed. And obviously, if anyone does have experience that they can share around that, obviously keep things confidential. Yeah, welcome to share that with the group. Got a question from Antonia. So I guess the question is directed to me. Can you explain the difference between a social enterprise and a social venture? As some university incubators have used this term, social venture rather than social enterprise. So um, essentially, social ventures are profit-seeking businesses that are intentionally set up to have a social and or environmental purpose. Um, and we kind of see social ventures or impact ventures as the kind of four models we showed on screen, with social enterprise being an example of that model. I'm conscious not to get too bogged down into definitions and how you badge yourself, because ultimately the most important thing is the impact you're having for your company. But you're right that in a university context, social venture is kind of the term that's most commonly used, perhaps because it comes across a bit more entrepreneurial and innovative, whereas there's a perception, perhaps incorrectly, that social enterprise is a bit more of a local focused, quite closely associated to local authorities and charities. So ultimately, it doesn't, I think from my perspective, it doesn't really matter what you badge yourself, but I think it's just important to kind of have some impact somewhere in your business. And one way of doing that is a social enterprise, but you'd also call yourself a social venture as well. So yeah, Jim, have you got anything to add on that one?
I would just say that, like, so Kieran, you're completely right when you say it. I'd also add that lots of people just misuse these terms
Mm.
or just use terms very loosely. Like a lot of people I meet use social enterprise as a byword for a kick, which is not necessarily the case. So I would the terminology gets bandied around quite loosely and is not always accurate or not always well defined. So I'd always just clarify with people
Mm.
what they mean when they put it down.
Yeah, definitely. I think linked to that as well, I see lots of people call themselves like charitable social enterprises, and obviously a charity is a distinct thing in law. And if your venture has what can be considered charitable purposes and you have revenue over 5K per year, you have to register as a charity. So it's important to be really clear what your venture is doing. And if it is a charity, go down the route of registering as a charity. But if not, make sure you have a purposes clause that doesn't unintentionally make you a charity and have to go down that route as well. But that's perhaps for another session. But got a question from Ray about the kick regulator. So essentially, how does the kick regulator or other third parties monitor if a kick doesn't breach its requirements to reinvest 35% of distributable profits, and what sanctions are there? So essentially, regulation of kicks is kind of, as I said, light touch. So the kick has to submit a yearly impact report on kind of the activities it's carried out through that year, and that is available on kind of the public record. Um, Kick regulator spot checks these, and if it has any kind of questions or considerations, it can enforce its regulatory powers, which, as I mentioned earlier, things like appointing or removing directors, and ultimately it can wind up the company as well if there's serious issues. And there are, if you kind of follow the kick regulator, which may be something I do because I'm an impact lawyer, but there are various kind of updates about the kick regulator and how it's used its enforcing powers. But I guess compared to the Charity Commission, which is the regulator of charities, is much more light touch. But some people don't want to set up a kick because they feel like there's perhaps enough internal regulation, either from the founders or other investors or other stakeholders, and you don't need a third party to do that. But on the flip side, other people like that extra assurance and transparency. Anything to add on that, Jem?
No, it was interesting. I actually didn't even know the answer to that question, so it was good to know. Good. I'm learning too.
Yeah, when I was learning a lot of your investment stuff as well, so it's mutual. So cool. So I think any more questions?
Got one in there from. Sorry, go on.
Oh
From
yeah, was it
Abigail.
Abigail's question? Yep. Do you want to do that one, Jem? I don't know if that's if you got that up on screen.
Yeah, sure. So, is it fair to say that most enterprises seeking social investment, have already achieved proof of concept and viability? Are there any investors that will support early stage R&D costs required to deliver innovation? So I'd say there are two categories here. Um, so if you're looking for debt finance or probably RPA two, you're probably going to struggle to find investors that will support that at an early stage with R&D. The way to go with that, in my experience, is to set up with share capital because angel investors are much more likely to back that kind of thing. Um, and also because they get these big tax breaks, SAS and EIS, they often want to invest at an early stage because those may not apply at a later stage. So uh, they so yeah, they are absolutely, yeah, are really up for that. And that's definitely the right place to go for them. But yeah, mainstream social investors, the big names I've just listed, big names in this world, CAF, Big Issue Invest are not providing early stage finance. Some might provide what they call investment readiness grants. So you might be finding that might go to Innovate UK for that, but those are grants. They're also hugely competitive for obvious reasons. There's lots of early stage businesses and not much money in those pots. So that might be something to look at. But yeah, angel investors is definitely the way I'd go with that.
Brilliant. We've got a question from Alan, who's building software to make personalized education available to more people at more affordable prices. So Alan's question is, how can I, turn that into an impact startup? I think firstly, sounds great and good that you're kind of dedicating your expertise and insights to make this available to more people. Um, I guess it's kind of starting where we finding about the outcome of your venture, which could be to, move the dial on educational access. And you could frame how you're going to do that is through your kind of software and perhaps offering that at more affordable prices. And in the impact spaces, we've got a one-for-one model, which is, I guess, pioneered by the shoe company Tom. So the way their model was you kind of buy a pair of shoes which you wear, and then they kind of donate another pair of shoes to someone in a different country who's kind of needing those shoes. So you could have something around that as well, where you kind of sell your products and services to kind of mainstream customers at a certain price, and you kind of make them less expensive to people who perhaps can't afford them. There's a variety of models you can do with that, but hopefully that kind of broadly answers your question. Jem, anything to add on that one?
Yeah, hard to sort of answer without knowing a lot more detail, but I'd say like the answer I'd give to everybody with this type of question, how can I show my impact, is do a theory of change, look up
Mm.
what that is, but really be clear on what the problem is you're solving and how your solution is the right solution for that problem. Theory of change is the best way of demonstrating that, I think.
Yeah, agreed. We've got a few more questions in the chat, but I'm really conscious of time. So, um, firstly, thanks. Well, thanks firstly to Jem for co-presenting alongside me. As I mentioned earlier, I learned a lot about social investment. I hope that everyone else listening did as well. And thanks to you all for listening to today's session. In terms of follow-up, so colleagues here will send you an email which will include this recording as well as our slides and some other resources, our free social venture handbook and links to our podcast I talked about, and also a report we published about impact investment. I think, Jem, you've got a few resources as well to share.
Yes, happy to share my slides, and then there's just loads on good finance, and I'll share a couple of websites where you can find resources to help you get started with raising investment from
Yeah,
equity investors.
and brilliant. We'll try and answer a few of those questions as well and follow up as well. But yeah, thanks everyone for your time. I hope you enjoyed today's session, and feel free to connect us on LinkedIn and more generally keep in touch. So thank you.